I'm going to start by showing you a diagram for merit goods, which is a common market failure, especially in developing countries for education and health, often because countries like this can't afford to provide them through the state for free, at least not for everyone. I'll let you see the diagram being drawn first, and then you can hear my explanation of what it means. So let's talk through the meaning of this diagram. First of all, you'll notice that there are two demand-style curves. The first one, the demand curve, is based on someone's perception of their marginal private benefit, but that's based on asymmetric information. They don't know enough about how education or health will help them. If they actually knew that with perfect information, they would use this demand curve and actually demand more of the good. So the market equilibrium A is based upon the intersection of supply and demand as usual, but actually leads to too small consumption at OQ1. If they had perfect information, then they would have a different demand curve here, and the intersection will be at B, the optimal point, with a higher level of consumption. So the gap between the two, OQ2 minus OQ1, is the underconsumption based on this asymmetric information. It might be, for example, that someone in a developing country doesn't realise the benefits of buying healthcare or education. The second diagram I'm going to show you is for a separate market failure, which we draw in a similar but not identical way, which is the market failure of a positive externality in consumption. And this is where there's a benefit that comes from buying health or education, but that benefit comes to a third party and not to the person buying or selling the education or health. So let's have a look at this diagram and try and understand it. In many ways it's very similar to the externalities that you will see later in production. We have two demand style curves. We have an actual demand curve here, which is equal to marginal private benefit. But we also have a demand style curve, which is the marginal social benefit, the benefit to society from this transaction, either health or education, taking place. We have a supply curve, which is both marginal private cost and marginal social cost. The gap between the two demand style curves, marginal private benefit and marginal social benefit, is the third party benefit or positive externality. The equilibrium is at A, but that actually produces quite a low level of consumption, OQ1. The optimal social point, where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit, is at B, and the output there is actually a much higher level of consumption of OQ2. So there is underconsumption. What's the welfare loss from that? Well, what we do is we take the two levels of consumption, the market level and the optimal level, and for that range of outputs, we look at the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost, and we turn that into the familiar welfare triangle of potential welfare gain, ABC. What might this be in a genuine developing country? Well, it might be that education makes for a more skilled workforce that all employers enjoy, or it might be that health investment leads to people being healthier in future and the taxpayer not having to pay for their hospital treatment later in life. The third market failure we're going to look at is inequity, which is probably the hardest of them to understand, and it results from an unequal distribution of resources. But equality and equity are not the same thing. So we start off with the concept of a Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient. We've learnt about these before. The green line shows a line of complete equality, and the yellow line some inequality, the red line a very large level of inequality. The further you are from the green line, the more unequal the society is. And you can then turn that into a number, a Gini coefficient, by dividing area A, the area between the 45-degree line and the Lorenz curve, by A plus B, everything to the right of the 45-degree line. The lower the Gini coefficient, the more equal the society. The higher Gini coefficient, the more unequal society. So this line here has a very high Gini coefficient, this has a lower one, and this has a Gini coefficient of 0. Not all LEDCs have high Gini coefficients, but some do. This tends to be quite specific to particular continents, but you can see here that many South American countries have high Gini coefficients, all of them in fact other than these two here. Some African countries also have high Gini coefficients, indicating high levels of income and wealth inequality. Why does this matter? Why might this be a market failure? It's about the impact that it has on people's ability to buy necessities. Now there's a crucial difference here between inequality, which is a quantifiable difference in the distribution of income, and inequity, which is a perception of unfairness. And in this case, we're saying there's an inequity. The unequal distribution of income, which we can measure, leads to a suboptimal resource allocation, which we can't really. In this case, it's because the poor have no access to education or health. Non-economists would simply say that this means that they can't buy something that is a necessity. But we have a different way of putting it. As economists, we would distinguish between effective demand, which is what people plan to buy given their incomes, and latent demand, which is what they would plan to buy if they had no budget constraint, if their incomes were higher. In this case, we're saying there's a big gap between effective demand, what they can actually buy, and latent demand, what they would actually like to buy. When that's for Porsches or Ferraris, that doesn't really matter. But when it's for necessities, like housing or health or education, then it is a big issue. We started by saying that inequality and inequity are not the same thing, but they are very strongly related. So how are they different? Well, inequality is something that you can measure using the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. It's something quantifiable. So it's part of what we'd call positive economics, the sort of scientific end of economics. That doesn't mean positive as in non-negative, it just means you can quantify it. Equity is much more of a normative concept. In other words, it's about matters of opinion and philosophies. There's no measurement for whether something is fair or not. It's something that we have to decide based on our value systems. But we use the positive concept, the scientific concept of inequality, to help us make that judgment. Now we're going to turn to another market failure for another issue, the issue of the environment and the market failure of negative externalities. I'm going to show you how to draw what should be an extremely familiar diagram, and then we'll apply it to the case of a developing country. In many ways, this is just the opposite of the positive externality diagram that we did earlier, but let's look through it. First of all, there's only one demand style curve, because in this case, demand is equal to marginal private benefit and marginal social benefit. But there are two supply style curves. The first is the actual supply curve, which is equal to someone's marginal private cost. And then we have this marginal social cost curve. And that's telling us that at every level of output, there is a difference between the private cost that someone incurs in making something and the social cost that is incurred when that good is produced. That cost actually gets bigger because of these diverging lines the more that is produced, which is probably realistic for something like pollution, a classic negative externality in production. What are the key points here? Well, first of all, the market equilibrium is where supply equals demand at point A. And that gives us output OQ1 and price of OP2. The actual optimal social point is where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit, and that's at point B. So there's a gap here, isn't there, between the output that the market produces, which is OQ1, and the output that would be associated with the optimal social point, the best output, which is OQ2. Notice, though, that the optimal output is not 0. It's where marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost. So, because of the externality, there is overproduction here. The third-party cost can be shown between the two curves. What's the cost to society? Well, the cost is the difference between the marginal social cost curve and the marginal social benefit curve between the optimal point and the market equilibrium. So that's this triangle here, the deadweight welfare loss, ABC. What might an example of this be in a developing country? Well, it might be pollution that's created to help develop that country, or it might actually be global warming, where the externality is generated in a separate country, but the cost, this third-party cost, is incurred in the developing country, for example in the form of climate change, like a drought or a flood. And its impact on productive capacity is shown in the next slide. Our final graphs are also very familiar. They're very similar to the ones that we drew when we looked at conflict and its impact on development. Let's start with figure 1. The production possibility frontier, or PPF, is here, and it shows the different combinations of goods and services that can be produced if all factors of production are fully and efficiently employed. What this is demonstrating is that in certain circumstances, this PPF might actually move in, which would be long-run negative growth. It doesn't often happen. It can happen in conflict. It's when the factors of production either reduce in size and quantity or they reduce in quality. Why might that happen from environmental effects? Well, the reason for this is that an environmental failure can actually degrade, for example, land, for example, polluting land. It might also pollute water resources, and it might damage people and their ability to work. Certainly, climate change has quite a big impact on agricultural land and the ability to grow crops in a consistent and predictable way. That's very much the worst-case scenario. But even if the production possibility frontier either stays where it is or continues to move out, it might actually move out more slowly than would otherwise be the case. Figure 2 shows us what you'd expect in a healthy developing economy, quite quick trend growth, what we might call catch-up growth, and around that actual growth will fluctuate according to the economic cycle. But if there's environmental degradation, with the environment being either made worse or even destroyed by pollution, then the trend growth can actually become a lot flatter. You're still seeing growth, but you're growing a lot more slowly than you might otherwise do, for example, because of land being poisoned or put out of use, or people being affected by pollution.